Hey, folks, welcome to a new episode of the Whiskey Ring Podcast. Today, we're visiting a new state, not new for me, but new for the podcast. We're going down to Delaware, which I'll be honest, until pretty recently was not aware that they had much distilling, despite my dad's down there, stepmom down there. I mean, you hear mostly about beer down there for sure, strong beer tradition, but not so much whiskey. And yet, to talk here today on the podcast, we've got Mike Rasmussen from Painted Stave Distillery in Smyrna, Delaware. And they're not only a distillery in Delaware, but also one of the ones that brought distilling back to the state and in the early days of the American craft whiskey boom. So with that, Mike, welcome on.
Thank you to have. I'm happy to be here, David. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start just where we usually start, and then we'll branch off from there, which is origin story for Painted Stave.
Sure. So it doesn't start with, my grandpappy was a moonshiner kind of thing or anything like that. My business partner and I started Painted Stave. We both come from academic backgrounds. Ron, the other owner, he was a scientist. He's got a PhD in physiology. He was doing cancer research up at Penn State College of Medicine. My background is in public policy. I came from a background of running leadership development programs and doing policy work for a think tank foundation. So we both came at this from the idea that we loved spirits, but we didn't know each other. This is the early days of the craft spirit sort of world, 2008, 2009. We both started seeing some of these products appear. Around here in Delaware, probably the first craft spirit to ever hit the shelf that I can remember would have been Blue Coat Gin from Philadelphia Distilling Company. And we had lots of beer. We're the home of Dogfish Head, and Dogfish Head sort of has done a great job of putting Delaware on the beer map. And they were actually making some spirits down there in their brew pub at the time as well. But it really wasn't something that we saw a lot of. But I came from a love of spirits. I was the kid in high school who'd show up to a party with a bottle of gin or scotch, which guaranteed I didn't have to share any of my booze with anybody, which was fantastic. And really, really loved it. But honestly, didn't know how people made spirits. I could tell you the basics of fractional distillation from some chemistry class, but it was not something that I was ever really focused on. I had some of these products that I saw appear on the shelf, like Blue Coat Gin, and then I was out in Portland, Oregon for a conference, and I think it was like a Wednesday morning, and I was walking around because I didn't have anything else to do before I had to get on my plane that afternoon, trying to hit a few different breweries. And I traveled for work a lot. So I did a lot of breweries, a lot of wineries, wherever I went. And one of the breweries I was at, they're like, oh, you ought to stop at this little distillery down the street, which was House Spirits. And I was like, cool. Wandered in there, probably the only person there on this like Wednesday, and tried, what is now the famous aviation gin. Plus they had like vodka, and they had some sochu that they were making at the time, and a few other interesting things. And I was just blown away. And then the fact that they were doing it in this little row house in Portland, Oregon, just changed my idea of what it could be. So I went back and I started reading everything I could find, which was mostly mostly home distilling stuff at that point in time. There really wasn't a body of knowledge around craft spirits from a scale perspective. Got in touch with Bill from ADI, started, learning a little bit more, bought his books, trying to get my head around it. And at the same time, my business partner was doing something very similar to that. One of the other distilleries that opened early on, a few years before us, was Catoctin Creek in Loudon, Virginia. And they did little bottling parties. You could sign up on their website and go and do that. And so unbeknownst to either of us, we had both actually signed up and gone over there and done bottling parties, and got a chance to meet Scott and Becky and just kind of see what it looked like. And we were both dreaming of doing this same sort of thing. I was living in the world of the production side of it. What does the equipment look like? How do you go about doing the manufacturing? I'd made beer, I'd made wine, home brewing, those sort of things, right? The basics of fermentation, but didn't really know much about the distillation side. My business partner, Ron, ever the academic, he delved into the legal side of it. What does the licensing look like? What is the legal requirements? All the stuff around COLA and things like that. What does a business plan need to look like in order for something like this to have a chance of being successful? And if you spend much time in Delaware, we are a tiny little state. Everyone kind of knows each other eventually. So no surprise, a mutual friend introduced the two of us when he heard that we were both sort of engaged in the same mental exercise as it was. And we very much wanted to do the same thing. So came together and started Painted Stave Distilling. That was the fall of 2011. We got together. I think it's August 2011. We incorporated a couple of months later. It took us another year, a little bit more than a year, to find a location. And we had to also create the craft distilling law for the state of Delaware. So this was not a legal business. Technically, Dogfish Head was doing it, and then they found out that they really weren't supposed to be doing it. But they figured that part. But for us to open, we had to write the legislation, go through a process of getting that passed with the state, which fortunately is not as hard in Delaware as it probably was in a lot of other places. We heard the stories from people in like New York or Pennsylvania that, years of work to really get a good craft distilling bill in place. Ours took a total of 12 weeks. So real quick. We spent some time searching, and fortunately for us, we came across an old movie theater that had been essentially abandoned in the town of Smyrna, which is pretty much the center of the state of Delaware. The town was really, really interested in seeing somebody go in there. They had hoped for a craft brewery, but the people who looked at it at the time, craft breweries they needed a minimum of 10,000 square feet of space, is what they had in their mind. 10 to 20 was what the conventional wisdom was saying, that's how much space you're going to need. This was about 6,000, so people had passed on it. It took a while. It took months and months for the project to come together, because we had done what a lot of folks were thinking about doing, which is we were going to find an industrial swing space, a couple of roll-up doors, put in a little tasting bar, and focus on the manufacturing side of it. I would tell you that we are very happy that we did not go in that direction. Mm-hmm. It took longer than we planned, took a lot more money to do the renovations on the old movie theater to make it a reasonable space. But in the end, we ended up with a really cool building that gives us an amazing amount of opportunity to do a lot of unique things at our facility, in addition to the space that we need to do all of the production that we work on. We started renovating in January of 2013, opened the doors November 8th of 2013. And so I guess that puts us about 12 and a half years into making spirits at this point.
It was fascinating to me to hear, for example, that you mentioned Dogfish was making alcohol. They were making spirits, from barley, because the rules were really wide.
Yes.
Can you remind me, what was the loophole, if you will, that they were able to do? This before 2012 and the law changing.
The rule in the code said that you could make alcohol from barley, or from malts, I think is actually what it may have said. It did not say that it could not be distilled spirits from that. Now, the reality is that they were making alcohol from everything other than barley. At the distillery, they were using NGS for making vodka. They were making rum, which obviously is not barley based. They were not producing any whiskey, which would have been the closest thing that you could do. So there was a little bit of once we put forward this craft distilling bill, it sort of became obvious that what's going on underneath this other thing isn't actually what the law is there to allow you to do. But fortunately, the state was very accommodating for that. They went back and made some changes to it to bring them into legal operations.
Okay, so no bad blood between you guys and Dogfish.
No, actually, we worked with Sam on the craft distilling bill. So Dogfish wanted to expand what they were doing, and they knew that they were going to need a separate craft distilling license in order to effectively do that. So we actually worked very closely. We walked the halls. We worked with Sam's lawyers to make sure that the bill that we had crafted matched up to what they wanted to see. We worked hand in hand to get it done and get it passed here. So there definitely we worked very well together, and we continued to work very well together as they opened their distillery a couple of years later, and they still operate it in Milton, Delaware.
Yep, and I've been meaning to go down and and visit to really taste their beers, because I love their IPAs, their East Coast IPA style. Excuse me. But so along with that, so the bill passes in 2012, goes into effect in 2013. So you're finally allowed to distill legally across all the different categories. And in the meantime, as you and Ron are ideating this out, I'm thinking about, you mentioned Catoctin Creek. You both went there for bottling to do a little bit there. Ron mentioned a few other people in an interview that kind of inspired him, John Little, Lance Winters, Todd Leopold. And you said that from your own experience, you'd had experience making wine, beer, fermenting, but
Yeah.
not the distillation part. So in addition to those people and Catoctin, who are some other, and the last part too is that, as you said, at the time, not a lot of literature out there, even from ADI, other than home distilling. So from what I've heard in the interviews, it was really just like you kind of figured it out yourself. There was a couple of consultants you could maybe talk to, but not a lot of places to ask. So who else did you go to for either inspiration or guidance in what you needed to do?
So certainly, while it, well past the statute of limitations on it, played around with as much of the home distilling stuff as I felt I could get away with in my basement. So learning a little bit there. We were also pretty fortunate. So while we were starting to look for equipment, Vendome Copper and Brass Works was working with Dave Pickerell to design a sort of specific craft equipment. And there were only two of those stills that had landed on the East Coast at that point in time. One was up at Sons of Liberty Spirits up in Rhode Island, and the other one was Hill Rock Distilling that was just getting started there in New York, a little bit north of you. So I had a chance to go and spend some time with Dave to learn both about that equipment and get to pick his brain for a bit on the ins and outs of some of the spirit production stuff. And he was obviously very, very helpful. He's sort of the godfather of a lot of the craft distilling stuff out there. So he was a great resource. I think the folks that Ron met, we met a lot of great people and through ADI, a lot of it, but folks like John Little out in West Virginia who, just were always really supportive. They were there. They responded to emails. Would help you out with questions. For me, it was a lot of equipment stuff. It was trying to make sure that we were designing a system that would work pretty well and be scalable, because that was really sort of the struggle that a lot of folks were going through. Scott and Becky at Catoctin Creek were going through trying to figure out how to grow their business. We were watching other people do that. Even Philadelphia Distilling, they were trying to figure out how they're going to grow and develop the business in different ways. And so I think we were learning as other people were going through some of these trials and figuring out what mistakes at things they had made or things that they would do differently. We got a lot of that opportunity to learn from those lessons when we reached out to people. And for the most part, everybody we met were just very, very open, wanting to share, really, really open and friendly. I think that was great. Because for us, there weren't that many people around us in Delaware we could drive to. But we traveled as much as we possibly could, tried to see people everywhere we could get to. The McKinseys up in Finger Lakes Distilling, the folks down in Florida, Drum Circle Distilling down there. He does Siesta Keys rums. Went down, tried to learn about rum from him. We were going to make everything. That was the goal. So we were like, all right, well, who makes really great gin? Let's go talk to them. Like, who makes really cool rum? Let's go talk to them. We tried to bring as much knowledge as we possibly could to both the design of the distillery and the manufacturing and that how-to production knowledge, because you couldn't really sign up unless you wanted to go to Harriet Watt or something like that. There really had no other options to go out and get some hands-on experience doing this. So there was a little bit of like cross your fingers and hope and pray kind of thing when we mortgaged our houses and bought all this equipment and didn't exactly know how to use it when day one came.
And in the years since, I mean, you described in the beginning, it was you really figuring out the equipment stuff. Ron was more on the legal side, the licensing, make sure that's all good. Since you guys have figured out what you're doing, and I know there's been evolution since, but you've got a pretty standard and stable base, is what I meant to say at this point. Is that divide kind of blurred more, or do you still feel like you both have pretty dichotomous roles in the distillery?
I think at first there were two of us, and so everybody does everything. We may have specialized in different areas a little bit in what we were thinking about but when it came to day to day, when it was production time, both of us are there doing production. Over the years, we've definitely moved to sort of divide and conquer a little bit more. So I have become much more focused on the production side of it, as well as our business has grown. We've added on things like we've added on a food truck. So I am doing a lot of that, and we've added on a lot of staff. And so there's HR, there's payroll, and all of that. And so more of the accounting and functional side of those day-to-day operations have fallen on Ron. And so we've sort of, I think, have more and more divided the way that we approach individual responsibilities. But when it comes down to the products, the ideas, the concepts, tasting, talking about, learning. We're still doing all that together. And actually, and we've managed to bring on more people because we've brought on some great staff who help us think about different ideas or things that we could do differently, flavor profiles and stuff. We've sort of grown the pie in that world from where we started, which was just me and Ron thinking, I like this, let's try and make some of that.
And I want to dive a bit into Delaware since, again, first time visiting for distilling purposes. So Delaware, for people who know, it's a very small state. There are 3 counties in the whole state. And in your county in particular, if not the whole state, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there was a very strong teetotaling tradition.
Yeah, Delaware is a little bit. So actually, Delaware has a fantastic distilling history, the way I like to think about it. But it really was around brandy. So if you were to look at going back to the 1700s, the early 1800s, Delaware was known for apples and peaches. We were one of the largest peach manufacturing or growing states. Our major market for a lot of that stuff was Philadelphia. And so there were apples and peaches leaving from here. And, obviously where there's apples and peaches, there's going to be apple and peach brandy. And so we were making a lot of those in small scale, sort of farm-based production, but there really weren't any big distilleries you could point to. The biggest one of a whiskey distillery was based out of Dover, just a little bit slightly south of us. It's called Levy and Gloss Kings. They shut down at the beginning of Prohibition, but they were operating from the late 1800s. But not a lot that really is about what you would get. Some really small scale apple and peach brandy manufacturing, and then one notable whiskey distillery, mostly making rye whiskey at the time. But we sort of straddle a bit of a line. People always talk about Mason-Dixon lines. Here in Delaware, it's kind of a joke because they're surrounding us. Every border is a Mason-Dixon line. So, but the northern portion of the state definitely was a lot more Philadelphia-centric. The southern 2/3 of the state and what is also the eastern shore of Maryland and the southern shore of Virginia, they were very agricultural. They were more aligned with probably some of the more conservative ideas that push prohibition. So Delaware is one of those states where the individual counties actually went dry much earlier than prohibition did. And the whole state went dry prior to national prohibition. But the county that we're in, Kent County, was 1907 when Kent County and Sussex County, where Rehoboth is, they went dry 12 years before national prohibition. However, right, there was still production, there was still consumption. It just wasn't as I guess as strong and as open as it may have been in the northern portion of the state.
Gotcha. And the distillery you mentioned, just lost the name of it in my head.
Levy and Gloss Kings.
Levy and Gloss Kings. Thank you. Levy and Gloss Kings. Yeah, the last one to produce, and they were producing rye. Not so much bourbon in the state. It fit the mid-Atlantic profile of Delaware, Maryland, Delmarva, of doing rye instead. So it's jumping ahead a little bit, but when you guys finally put out a bourbon, it was the first legally made bourbon that you could tell in Delaware.
Yeah. We sort of actually we had a little bit of fun with that because we just call it Delaware style bourbon since we're the first ones and really the only ones making bourbon in the state of Delaware. So, but the rye tradition was certainly stronger here, right? And people refer to Maryland style rye. We refer to it as Mid-Atlantic style rye since that is the style that was being made not just in Maryland but in this whole area around here at that point in time. But yeah, bourbon didn't exist as a product, at least made by anybody here in Delaware, until we came along and started producing it.
And to me also, now that I've been buying spirits for a number of years and from different states, Delaware has continued to have very strict control and DTC laws. So I don't think it's quite as bad as Pennsylvania, but it's up there. Like nothing in, nothing out. I was trying to look up the current state of DTC, and I think you're now allowed to do wine through state, but not quite spirits yet, right?
No, the wine bill that finally passed, and there's folks who've been working on this there pretty much their entire lives, and it will actually go into effect. There's a 1 year now prep on it, so it's actually not even in effect just yet. We do have a few wineries that utilize some third-party providers to do fulfillment for spirits. There are some workarounds, but from a consumer perspective, any spirits, wine, or beer shipped to you in the state of Delaware is against the law at this point. Not to say it does not happen in very large amounts, but it is not legal yet to receive anything shipped to you. And what that means is that most states, because of reciprocity laws, won't allow any of our stuff to be shipped out to them, which becomes tricky, right? For a small state with, we just 1 million people in our state. Now, in the weekends, in the summer, when the beaches fill up, we maybe get a few 100,000 more. But reaching more of a market is tough because we can't ship our products like some states can do. We have a traditional 3-tier system, so we can't do self-distribution or things like that. We even have restrictions against things like selling at farmers markets, right? You can go up in New York where you're at farmers markets, the fairs and stuff on the weekends, that people can show up and sell their stuff there, which is really cool. We're restricted from doing even those things. So really, we can conduct sales at our distillery, and we can conduct sales through our 3-tiered system and a distribution partner for Delaware for that, and then utilizing the typical 3-tiered distribution system to move into other states.
So you've, on one hand, very restrictive. On the other hand, there is, just on the legal sides of distribution and moving things around, you are fortunate in that close enough to, let's say, a DC type place where very few rules. You can, if once you get product there, you can go to 41, 42 states.
Yeah, that's the Wild West.
And then you've also got Total Wine headquartered nearby.
Yep.
That's in Maryland, I believe.
They're headquartered in Maryland, but they started in Delaware.
Right. So they're very familiar with it, and they're a huge, not only a huge buyer, but a huge distributor. That in saying so, distributing to their stores, not a distributor in and of themselves. Access to more markets. But I agree with you. Like Delaware itself, not a huge market, and I don't know the statistics quite yet of where it ranks in terms of per capita spirits consumption.
We are always, it's us in New Hampshire that usually hit the top, but that is because so many people come here and buy spirits who don't live here, right? If you're anywhere near New Hampshire, you know about where those state liquor stores are on the highway, and everyone from Vermont and Massachusetts and everywhere else can drive there. We have a very similar thing because of our proximity to Pennsylvania. So coming across the border to the liquor stores in the northern portion of the state, there are a lot of Pennsylvania tags on those. So while we have, if you just go by volume of sales in the state of Delaware, we are always at the top. A lot of that is exported. We are not as drunk as everyone thinks we are.
Look, we've had, and I say this with all due respect, we've had distilleries in Wisconsin, and I love them all, and they're usually number one on the list, and it's usually for brandy, not even for whiskey. So love it. So I realized I skipped a step too, which is, both of you guys are Californians by growing up and by birth. I was going to say by nature. That's not quite right. Both Californians. So how did you end up in Delaware and in Smyrna to begin with?
So
you said Ron was nearby in Pennsylvania.
Well, sort of. So he had ended up really through the University of Delaware is how it sort of comes together. Ron had, after he finished his PhD in Texas at MD Anderson, he got a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Delaware. And so he had done most of his schooling as a young man in California. He moved to Texas to do his doctoral work, and then had an opportunity, and that brought him to Delaware. For me, I had grown up in California. I had moved to upstate New York in high school and did college there. And the University of Delaware had an AmeriCorps program that seemed like a neat opportunity. I didn't have anything else to do after graduating from college. So came to Delaware to essentially do a year of volunteer work for AmeriCorps, which, because of the connection with the University of Delaware, afforded the opportunity to stay here for graduate school. So really, it was the University of Delaware and graduate school that ended up bringing both of us here. But we had both lived in or around San Diego and California. We'd gone to the same beaches in Mexico and eaten at the same taco stands and had a lot of the same sort of pieces there. We had both lived in Texas for a bit. I had been there out in San Antonio, working in kitchens and bartending there prior to coming to Delaware. Ron had been in MD Anderson in Houston. So we had some similarities, though we had never crossed paths, and it was the University of Delaware that really brought us here. So when we met, I was living near the university in Newark. Ron was living just over the border in Pennsylvania. That's where he and his wife had moved to after they had met at the University of Delaware. And we started looking for potential locations, and we kind of knew we wanted to be between where we were, which was the northern portion of the state, and the central portion of the state, which is Dover, really. That area is the highest population area. It's also pretty close to where all of the rest of our jobs and things like that were likely to be. We both have wives with good careers, and that's why we get to go off and run off and make whiskey. And so we needed to be near where their work was going to be. And we kind of ranged ourselves for where we wanted to be. And the town of Smyrna was in that range. We knew a number of different people around the state and sort of started asking around on potential locations, most of which was industrial parks. Most of the places that we went to and took a look at were your typical industrial spot. And they're like, oh, you can rent 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, however much space you wanted. But a friend of ours, she knew about an industrial space here in the town of Smyrna, but the town had also been trying to find some place to, or something to move into this old movie theater that was sitting downtown. It had been, kind of sitting there abandoned and falling apart for like a decade at this point in time. The town, probably the best economic development investment the town ever made, from my perspective at least, decided the thing to do was to actually throw us a party. So when they heard we were looking around at potential locations, they gathered the who's who of the whole community, got us together at one of the old houses in town, had the Newell family host us, and had it catered. And, we just got an opportunity to meet absolutely everybody. And they were on message. They were like, the old movie theater would really be a great location for this. Have you looked at the old movie theater? Like, everyone was right there. It's funny because we are one of the only distilleries that I know of that is located directly next to a church. Mm-hmm. So our neighbor on one side is the Presbyterian church. Across the street is the fire department. And so we're like, I mean, it's a neat idea, but like, it's right next to a church. Aren't there rules against that? And then they're like, well, no, like, here's the mayor. And they're like, no, yeah, there's no zoning rules. We'll make sure that everything is perfect for that. And we're like, all right, well, what is the church going to think about it? Like, well, here's Reverend Riley. Reverend Riley, what do you think about it? And he's like, oh, we're totally supportive of it. I'm Scotch heritage. I'm a Scotch drinker, but it's okay. They made it as easy as possible to make the choice. So the town was really, really supportive. I think that is also something that I know a lot of small distilleries run into. And we've had people who have called us from all over the place because there's a church 2 blocks away, but it's within their 500 feet or something like that. And like, how did you get this done? I'm like, we were breathing rare air here. Everybody wanted us in this location. It took a while because the logistics of taking an old movie theater, right? If you think about it, the sloped floor where my still sits, the original floor is 2 feet below us. Things like that were very challenging to us from the perspective of, we're just trying to get our doors open and we don't really know what we need. And if you're telling me I'm going to need to pour, an extra 4,000 square feet of concrete on top of this, that's 2 feet deep. We had along the way, we met a gentleman who was an engineer, lived here in town. He actually came to us and said, hey, look, what if I buy this building and do all the major stuff that you would need so it's easy enough for you to move into it? And then I'll put my offices up on the second and third floor, the old mezzanine and the old projection room and stuff like that. And that really made it happen, right? It was a community effort of people coming together to get us into this building. And I think in the end, it's a really great investment, right? Well, this last year, we saw about 20,000 unique visitors come through the distillery. Now, many of those are local folks who, there are regulars. They're always here on Thursdays or Fridays or Saturdays. A lot of them are people who are traveling through and are stopping in and enjoying themselves. We pull from all the top of the state and the bottom of the state. We have folks who drive up from Lewis and Rehoboth who come up on a regular basis to spend time with us. So for a small town, 20,000 unique visitors coming through in the course of a year is a great economic development piece. And so I think in the end, the investment paid off for us in having a really unique space. And I think has paid off pretty well for the town in that we've invested a lot. We bring a lot of people to town and we employ a solid number of folks from here in town as well.
I mean, I think your staff, at least as the last I saw, was above 30 at this point.
Yeah, we're probably right around 30 between the distillery and our taco trucks.
Right. So, I mean, it's a lot more than just the two of you now. And I love the fact that they were willing to bring you in. I was definitely going to have you tell the church story because that's fantastic to me. And the difference between if you had a Presbyterian church versus a Lutheran church or a Baptist church, you would have had a very different story.
Yeah.
Smyrna too, I think you mentioned this number earlier when you were looking very small town, 4,000 people. Just in the time since then, it's now up to 12, 13,000. So rapidly growing. Delaware has become one of those states like Florida used to be, like Arizona, some of the Carolinas, where there's no income tax for the state. It's a great state to retire to, so there's a lot more people coming down there who aren't going to those other states anymore. Also, a very business friendly state, other than the alcohol restrictions.
Sure.
I think like 90% of U.S. businesses have a licensure
most
there.
of the Fortune 500 companies and all that. We do have income tax though. We have, but we have caps on income tax for people over a certain age. So I pay income tax, but we have made it a very attractive state for people to retire to, and comparatively, we have very, very low property taxes. I think that is one of the big attractors, especially from folks from New York or New Jersey or in places like that.
God knows, yes. With the movie theater too, I know that you have since undergone a brand transition, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but this was really central to your early identity. And I was thinking too, it reminded me of a number of distilleries for sure, even recently, that I've spoken to, one of them being the Distillery of Modern Art down in Georgia. Now they're in Chamblee, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta, but they were saying how, I was speaking to Matt Greif, their head distiller, and he was saying Atlanta was just a pain. They were making everything difficult. They couldn't find a space. It was expensive. And then they look at this town just outside, and the town's like, yeah, come on in. Like, we'll find a space for you. Tell me what size you need, and we'll figure it out. And thus they have a distillery, a tasting room, house. I know they mature more offsite now, but a similar kind of story where they find the place that welcomes them in. I mean, that makes such a difference too with I was thinking also Far North, who would probably be a couple of weeks ago now in terms of episodes coming out. Very small town for Mike and co.
Mm-hmm.
They got all the licenses in like a couple of hours because they just called the town council, who's 2 people, and they said yes and bringing a business back. So I love those ideas, because the idea of distilleries and this industry that had been banned for so long becoming an economic driver is fantastic. Now, I will say, as looking across kind of a statewide look at this, there's still not a lot of distilling happening in Delaware.
No.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, we just lost one of our distilleries. They closed their doors. I'm going in a few days to pick up the remaining of their inventory that we're taking off their hands for them. So yeah, from a true sort of craft distillery operations, it will be us and Dogfish Head. We have somebody who's producing vodka, which is, they're bottling NGS. So while they have a craft distilling license, they're not, I think, a craft distillery as most people conceive of it, where there's stills and barrels and all of that stuff going on, and a tasting room. And then we have the craft, the brew pub license we've got at least one bar that operates as a craft distillery, though they produce probably a very, very small percentages of what it is that they sell there. But if you were to talk about folks really making spirits here in Delaware in any serious way, it'll be us and Dogfish Head. As of, I think the other place surrenders their license this week.
So I have to ask, your DSP 21002 is Dogfish 001?
Yep.
Yep.
Yep. And 003 is the one that's just shutting their doors. So.
I still don't understand why the DSPs restarted with the 21s and all. But anyway, so much nicer to just be like DSP 2 or something like that. Waste not, while not. Anyway, so as I mentioned, well, actually, you know what? Let me step back for a second again and say, because I didn't say this at the opening, and I usually do in these situations, which is I found out about Painted Stave because of Lost Lantern. So Adam and Nora up at Lost Lantern, if you're a listener to the show, huge fan of theirs. They have pointed me to so many different distilleries in the U.S. that I should be paying attention to, that I should be looking at. And that can be ones that they've put out a product with, and some that they haven't yet, but they're like, you should still take a look at this place. Like, they're really interesting. We're just not there yet with them. And the introduction came through. I'm pretty sure Adam was writing that introduction like while Nora was in labor. So we'll deal with, she'll deal with him on that later. But the bottle that came through was a cask strength, as they do, cask strength single cask of your single pot still, or your pot. Excuse me, I want to make sure I'm right. Single pot still or pot still style?
Just pot still, yeah.
Just pot still.
Yeah, we just call it pot still, yeah.
Yeah. So pot still style, or pot still. Let's just say pot still. Pot still whiskey at, about 133, 134 proof, just beautiful. And it was something really unique. And I know that's an overused word, but I'm trying to use it more intentionally now when I have a whiskey that is really just different. And this one fit the bill. So that was how I was introduced to you, was this really just powerful, has a little bit of beech smoke in there, or different smokes in there for the smoked malt, mostly barley, unmalted barley, smoked malt, and then rye aged for 2 years in your ex-rye barrels. So this is a style that, as Adam pointed out on the website, it wouldn't fit in the Irish technical files for two reasons. One being you're not in Ireland, and two being too much unmalted in there to qualify.
It's sort of so when there's a part of me that's a bit of a historian, and so digging into as much as I can from distilling history in different places, being literally everything that I could possibly find, and so finding some of the old like Uscaban, like sort of recipes for Irish style whiskeys, and learning the history of how pot still whiskey came about, the malt tax and everything around that, I found very, very intriguing. And so it was one of those styles of whiskeys that I went to seek out, right? At the time, 2 or 3, you could find Green Spot and Redbreast, probably the only pot still whiskeys I could find anywhere in Delaware. But I really liked the idea of creating an Irish style whiskey, because not Irish whiskeys, we're not in Ireland.
Sure.
And we wanted to try and create something like that would give us a couple of different things. I mean, it is a lighter whiskey than bourbon or rye whiskey. It does, because we're using used casks, and we're using our second use bourbon and rye barrels for a few different things. So this one is for the rye barrels. The idea there was we can be a little bit of efficiency, make another whiskey that we can age in some of these used casks and get a second life out of those, and also create something that is a little bit lighter and more approachable on the palate for folks who are, I would call them whiskey curious. Prior to making all of these whiskeys, I was the friend who knew a lot about whiskey, right? And so when people wanted to learn to drink whiskey, they would come along, and I hated the stories where people were just like, oh yeah, I've got this like expensive bourbon somebody gave me, but I don't like it because it's too oaky. Or someone gave me this bottle of Johnny Walker Blue Label and it tastes like Band-Aid soaked in seawater. And I'm like, yeah, those are really good whiskeys, but they're not what you should learn to drink. But they're not what you're likely to learn to drink whiskey on. And so I always pointed people towards Irish whiskey. And it's lighter. It's going to have a lot more easier sort of approachable characteristics that your whiskey curious folks might enjoy. And then we can bring them along into the bourbons and the ryes, and then eventually like down the road you can get to the Isle of Scotches, hopefully. So I really liked that. And so part of that ethos that we came to the distillery with is we weren't going to be a distillery that made one product. We were going to a distillery that tried to make something for everybody. And so as we were making bourbon and we were making rye, we knew that we wanted to make some other whiskeys that had a little bit of a lighter profile. Now, so obviously the cask strength one, she's cooking pretty strong. We typically are bottling that in the high 80s. I think 84, probably 94 is that the range where we generally have been bottling the pot still, because anything at 130 some is probably a specialty whiskey.
Yeah, but that's not going to welcome people in.
No, not really.
Yeah.
But I think that's sort of one of the ideas of what brought us to making a pot still whiskey, because there really weren't many of them around. It was a piece of history that we could ultimately teach people about, bring something to the table that was unique and a lot of people weren't doing it, and that filled a bit of a gap in what I think was the sort of the whiskey like portfolio that we were going to have, because we were having the bourbon and the rye. At the same time, we were also doing a corn whiskey with a lot of smoked malts in it, and aging that in our used bourbon barrels. So we had this like smoky, sweeter whiskey, and we wanted something that had those lighter characteristics, the more nutty, a little bit of that. And that's where I came upon that sort of recipe. And I think I found a number of old recipes that usually sat in that right around where we wanted to be, mostly that 60 to 70% unmalted barley. The malts at the time, if you went back historically, they would have been being, wood fire dried. Some of them would have been peating depending on where you're at, but there would have been that. So we looked for a really light smoke on a malt, and that beech smoked malt was probably one of the lightest ones that we could find, and then balanced out the grain a little bit with a little bit more malt and a little bit of rye. So a unique recipe to what we are, but trying to be sort of close to some of the historical style guidelines for that pot still whiskey.
Again, I hope that more of it becomes available. I've not tried it at the classic strength. Let's say I've only tried it at that high proof, so it's hard to go back from that sometimes. But I definitely still want to taste how most people would taste it, to see what you're. I mean, that's like you said, that's what's going to pull people in. That's where you start them if they can't quite handle the bourbon or the rye yet. Maybe not even the corn whiskey because of the apple and the mesquite smoke in there. So with the bourbon and the rye, so I do want to say, as many do, you started with gin, vodka, while laying down whiskeys because you got to keep the lights on. And I don't know if this is still the case, at least for the white spirits, but for the first few years, like you never sourced NGS, you were still making your own.
So we did source NGS. So that was on the recommendation from Dave Pickerell when we talked with him very early on, and we were like laying out all the things we want to do, and he was just like, "You're an idiot, like don't do that." He's like, "You're never going to, you can redistill and make cuts into it. You can, use an NGS." So we spent a lot of time searching for an NGS partner that we thought provided something that was really good and we could work with. We use a wheat-based NGS for both of those, and they are distilled, right? Our vodka, we put the NGS back in the still, we distill it to get that copper contact, make the cuts how we want them to be. But from the beginning, we use NGS for those two products, but they both get distilled on site. So
sure. And I mean, the type of stills that Dave advocated for, like you guys have the 250 gallon Vendome hybrid. Okay. So yeah, he usually did either 250 or a 500 gallon, but mainly the same kind of setup, like 250 or 500 gallon pot attached with a column of between 6 and 8 plates on there. I think yours has 8 if I was counting.
We have the 4-plate column directly on top of it, and then
Right.
we've got it's a little bit of a different design for the secondary column. It's got 16 sieves in it, so not bubble cap plates. So a little bit of a different design, and that was working with Vendome to come up with a way, like, how do we create something that we're not trying to go from, I don't want to be an NGS manufacturer. I'm not trying to pump out lots of that. So I didn't need to build for volume around that idea. So we designed, like, how do we create the things that we think are going to give us the control, even if we're redistilling NGS, to help us develop the flavor that we want? How do we get the copper contact in there in that? How do we get that additional reflux that's going to bring us up to the level that we want it to? And so we worked with them to sort of figure out a way to make a secondary column that was really intended for that purpose.
Gotcha. So, I mean, even with that addition, these stills are not super efficient for NGS. So the running it once, however many times you run it through just to make your own cuts, that's one thing. But to start from the beginning of the process, it wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
So,
especially when our goal was to be doing the whiskeys, right? The vodka and the gin. Now, I mean, we move a lot of vodka and we move a lot of gin, right? They still pay the bills, and they're very, very good products. I'm very, very proud of them. But yeah, the goal was, build the still so that we can make anything, but we know that these are the things that we have a lot more passion about. So where we can, let's prioritize the design and things that it maximizes the time that we can commit to those products.
And so with the gin, I do want to mention the previous names because they harken back to history. So the Silver Screen Vodka for the movie house, and the Candy Manor Gin, which has its own story to it of being a candy store with an adult offering at the top.
That's right.
We will say. So, these brands, as I said earlier, you've gone through a brand transition, which I understand, from a house of brands to a brand house.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny. It's the reverse of Far North, just because they're right in my recent memory. So it's the reverse of them. You mentioned that in designing the Irish whiskey, how you wanted to go, Irish style whiskey, excuse me, that you wanted to go through. And also that the rye was going to be this mid-Atlantic style, Maryland for the purists, but I agree with you, mid-Atlantic style. When it came to the bourbon, you said you and Ron were both fans of the high rye bourbon, not really wheater fans comparably. So without much distilling history in Delaware outside of brandy and rye, when you were thinking about what this mash bill is going to be for the bourbon that we want to make it, call it Delaware style, what was that iteration process like?
Yeah. So there were a few different things that went in there. One was, we obviously drank as much as we possibly could, right? Buy as many of the bourbons that are out there on the market and try lots of things to hone in on flavor profiles that you really enjoy. And so where we both tipped towards is the high rye bourbons were our own sort of personal favorites. They're the places we grabbed. Many of them are fantastic. The classic Kentucky styles, the wheaters, all of those, like I can like and appreciate all of them. But the spicy notes and the little bit of depth and things that come from rye were very, very appealing to both Ron and I. So just inherently, you kind of make what you like. And so we started from that perspective. But I think something that we talked about a lot, and this is true of all of our spirits, is how are people going to drink this? And so when we started with that in mind, it wasn't just let's just create a bourbon that I'm going to like sipping on, but let's think about like how can we make products or make in for the Bourbon A product that is a little bit unique to us in a space that is actually fairly constrained compared to some other spirits, right? You are a little bit limited in what you can do. You have to use the new charter. Yes, you can make choices about the barrels and you have to use corn, but you can make choices about the recipes. But in reality, you're not talking about huge gaps between like what the different characteristics are likely to be, especially not to your average consumer, right? Your prosumer sort of person may really, really feel strongly and have that distinction between them, but your average person, I think, is probably not there. And your average person is what keeps our bills paid. So we had a lot of the conversations about that. We're like, how are people going to drink this? Like most people going to drink this. And they're going to drink it in cocktails. It's how the vast majority of spirits in this country and around the world are consumed. So yeah, there's going to be the folks who like it neat, or there's the folks who like it on the rocks, but there's a lot of it's going to go into old fashions. A lot of it's going to go into whiskey sours that's going to be used in other ways. How do you make a spirit that is different when ultimately you're not the only thing that they're probably utilizing in this? And so stuff like a high rye bourbon, well, okay, inherently you've already got a little bit of a distinction because you've got the extra spice and the characteristics that are going to come from that rye. And then we thought, how do you take this and make it stand up and be noticeable in an old fashioned or in a Manhattan or in a whiskey sour? And so we wanted to go as much as we could reasonably on the side of a more set of robust characteristics is where we ended up with. The high rye bourbon heads in that direction. Using, really heavily charred barrels heads in that direction. And those things together give it some ability to stand up on its own, especially when it's being consumed in the way that we see most of it head out the door, which is in the form of a cocktail. So we've kind of, even in crafting our gin, in crafting the vodka, and crafting just about all of them, we have that as an active, ongoing conversation. How does this work in a cocktail program? Does it fill a gap that's there? Because that's what we're trying to imagine with each one of the spirits. If your product is instantly replaceable with any other bourbon that's on the market, well then, people could use any other bourbon that's on the market. How do you make it a little bit unique? Because I'm never gonna I'm not gonna out Jack Daniels, right? So I'm not gonna try. I'm not gonna go in that direction. I'm gonna try and find something that I think makes it a little bit different, even in a space that could be fairly constrained.
And I mean, I'm having, as we're talking, I'm sipping on the bourbon, and it's a 66% corn, 26% rye, 8% melted barley mash bill. I'm almost positive I haven't seen that mash bill before. So 26% rye, that's a high rye bourbon.
Very high.
Yeah. I think offhand, the only major Kentucky brand, like the big brand that's going to have a higher one is the Four Roses High Rye. And that's, at 30% for those, that's 4% off. Not very much.
Yeah.
But of course, that does bring down the corn.
Yeah. There's a couple of others that are in that low 20s and in the ranges that are out there. So I
was gonna say like Basil Hayden's, I guess, like those are that's the high rye too. I always forget them honestly because I think of the classic beam with in the low teens.
Yep.
But yeah, it brings down the corn a little bit, 66%, still well into bourbon territory. But what I was struck by in tasting this is that it still maintains a really strong sweetness, not saccharin. It's not like drinking syrup or like a PX kind of thing where you just can't drink more of it because it's so sweet. But instead, it's sweet and then it's spicy, and you get that extra char from the heavily charred 30-gallon barrels. And at the same time with the 30-gallon, like this batch of the bourbon that I'm sipping on is aged for 6+ years. And at 6+ years in a 30-gallon barrel, especially a heavily charred one, I would think you could run the risk of being over oaked pretty easily. You got a lesser barrier that's really broken down with the heavily charred. You have more surface area connection. Delaware is not in an extreme environment where it's going to be super hot, super cold. It's pretty temperate. So you're going to have mostly consistent year over year interactions as well with the wood. So with the use of the high rye and the heavy char 30-gallon, how have you managed to, or how did you come about to your maturation style that has allowed this to be, in my mind, both very complex, very well matured, but not very oaky?
So there's a little bit of obviously choices in blending as we're bringing them together. We definitely find some oaky barrels. We're for our cask club, for our sort of like whiskey club, have harvested some 9-year-old barrels out of those 30-gallon casks, and in sampling some of them, they can come out quite strong. So there is a little bit of blending that's involved in that. I think part of it is the choice in the oak. So the 30-gallon barrels are coming out of barrel mill. They're coming out of the northern white oak. They've got that tighter northern grain compared to especially the white oak out of like Arkansas or Missouri or something like that. So I think that helps to give them a little bit more time. We do have a bit of a moderate climate. We get some hot summers, but it's not Kentucky hot. And we get some cold winters, but they're usually pretty short. We're, not far off the coast. The Delaware Bay is 6 miles to the east of me. We have a pretty moderate climate here, and I think that is a contributing factor to it. But we do have an uninsulated warehouse, our barrel house. It can get pretty warm there in the summer. So I think there's a combination of a few different choices that we've made that I think help with that. The goal was heading towards more oaky and more robust. That was sort of where we wanted to be in the profile we were looking for. Maybe it's also part of that's the Delaware style, I guess.
I mean, there's really only one company that's going to fight you on that, and it doesn't sound like they're going to fight you on that. So
no, yeah. Sam's got no interest in bourbon as far as we know.
Right. So with the uninsulated warehouse, that reminds me as well. Like I want to emphasize this, and this is in a good. I'm looking at this in a good way. Like you guys, I think, would still qualify as a micro distillery. Very small production, even across these multiple product lines. So, in terms of that warehouse and aging, like how many barrels would you say you have locked away right now?
Probably in that 400-ish or so barrels of bourbon and rye that are sitting back there, plus the little random experimental things and all of that. Our volume is pretty small, and we've been slowly bringing up the age of our products, as a lot of distilleries do, right? We released our first bourbon as a yearling, which 10 years after that now, I wouldn't be terribly proud of that, but we wanted to put something on the market as much as we could, and we moved. The second year or the third year we moved in, and we finally had a straight bourbon, and we've been getting progressively older and older and older in our blends. We really wanted, one of our goals was we really wanted to hang our hat on bottled in bond. That was a spot where we were very, very proud when we could start consistently releasing bottled in bond whiskey. So the rye whiskey that we do, we still our major expression of that is a bottled in bond, because the volumes that we have and how we've sort of staged production allow us to get to that. But knowing that was the first real marker of quality in the whiskey world, and seeing a lot of other craft distilleries sort of also take that as a chance to hang their hat, like we've finally arrived type of thing, when we're able to really put out something, a consistent and good product at that 4+ year range. But every one of them is, they're all challenges in doing each one of the different products and figuring out how it fits into the portfolio for a small, a micro distillery. I think we're above nano size, but we're definitely not one of the big players.
Sure. And You said you've got a couple of experiments going on. I know the rye is a Maryland style, mid-Atlantic style. I'm going to keep catching myself on that. So a not as high rye on there, but you do have 100% rye, at least one cask aging. You have a bourbon made with only red ingredients. A couple other experimental things. You have pot still and red wine. So you have the room to really play around with this. And another one that we'll talk about is the American single malt, which I also got to try. That you're releasing this one barrel a year.
One barrel a year.
Yeah, it's a really special release, smaller bottles to spread it out a little more. So you have like you said, you have the room to experiment with it while building up to the rye being bottled and bond. It's at least 4 years old. This bourbon, like I said, is 6+. I forget what the age on the age on the Lost Lantern was 5 years, I believe.
Yeah, I think that was 5-year cask.
Right. So,
and that is the most of the whiskeys that we're doing, they're typically 4+. We're finally seeing the cask that we laid down that we wanted to leave for 10 years. Well, they're going to hit 10 years this year, and there'll probably be a special release for some of those that we roll out as 10-year releases. But that's the fun of it, right? If I was only trying to make one bourbon and one rye, it really, I think, it would turn into more of a job than it is something that's as much fun as it is to do. So being able to do the weird little one-off whiskeys, the experimental things. We did a whiskey that had 42 different types of malted barley in it. It was, we could never make that again because all of the way it ended up in ours. And it was a really unique whiskey. And the problem was it was really good. And we liked it, so we had to figure out a way, and that's actually it's the approximation of that is that proximity malt, the American single malt you've got there. But we've tried to, wherever we could, continue to do some like weird or fun or different things. It's both good for me as the distiller because it allows me to challenge myself, try different things, play with new ingredients. It's also really nice because it gives us something to offer our consumers. Those folks who are our regular consumers who are coming back and probably not as fickle and always after the new thing as the sort of the beer world tends to be. But folks want to try something different. They want to learn about a new spirit, and we try and bring that to the table as much as we can. Well, actually, this year we'll roll out a couple of brandies in conjunction with the 250th anniversary of the United States and the 250th anniversary of Delaware, seeing as we were the first state to sign on. But things we've been planning for a number of years, 4 or 5 years at this point, because I want to teach people about the history of Delaware spirits, and brandy is a big piece of that, even if we know that it's bourbon and rye and vodka and gin are ultimately the things that we're going to move. Those are the things going to keep us going.
Sure. I mean, that's why even now, most distilleries that are not exclusively American single malts are making bourbon and rye because those are the ones that sell. I mean, there are a couple that have been very successful, as we know, being only single malts or malted spirits, but we know them because they're exceptions.
Yeah.
So at this point, still bourbon and to a lesser extent rye are still going to drive the whiskey conversations. Before we dive into the malt, I wanted to also jump back to something you said, which reminded me, which is that you were really diving into the history. So you talked about mash bills and looking at what was being distilled in the area, but the name for Painted Stave also comes from diving into that history. And I'm most curious, I think, I'll let you tell how it came about, but I'm most curious to find out at what point in your story you discovered this history. Like, did you, when you had the space and knew you were going to be moving into either Smyrna or into the movie theater itself, at that point, did you know what that name was going to be?
No. So the name Painted Stave Distilling, or the name Painted Stave, comes from some regional history that I found actually in microfiche in the basement of the library at the University of Delaware, trying to learn about Delaware history and Delaware spirits, which didn't come up with a lot of stuff at that point in time, but have managed to fill it in since then. So that was probably 2010 or so. I was just trying to learn more about what the history of spirits were in this area. This is before seriously even pursuing the idea of opening a distillery. It was my sort of personal education that I was heading down that path of. But the original name for the distillery was actually going to be something different until we got our first article in the newspaper when we started the renovations on our building here, and then very quickly got a cease and desist letter from Sazerac saying, oh, nope, we own something materially similar to that. and you can go ahead and not use it, or we'll sue you to the point where you don't exist before you even exist. So, and then we came to find out lots of people get those letters from Sazerac. They own so many things, and their lawyers love to send out those letters apparently. So, but fortunately for us, I think it was a good thing in the end in having to go through a name change, and we hadn't really spent much money aside from maybe a couple of like branded shirts and a tent or something like that at that point in time. The name for Painted Stave, the reference that I found for it was very similar to the same references that people would have, like striped pig or a blind tiger or something like that. Those oddities that were used as some way to refer to a way to purchase alcohol when you weren't allowed to do so. So the reference came out of the Richmond area, and I forget which newspaper it was in. Richmond, is it Sentinel maybe? One of the very, very old newspapers, and pre-prohibition here. And Virginia, like Delaware, went dry prior to prohibition. So someone had come up with this sort of idea of painting a stave, one of the staves on a barrel, and leaving it outside their door as sort of an easily manipulable billboard. If the painted stave was facing out towards the street, it meant that there was alcohol available, and when it was turned back around and you couldn't see it, then it was, closed for business kind of thing. But it was a neat little piece of history. It had to do with barrels. It had a visual, an image that you could easily sort of put together. So we really liked the idea. It was on this long list of potential names for brands or products or other things. And so when we needed to go through a name change, and we sat down and we're like, all right, well, what are we going to call this? And we didn't want, there was a brew pub that was opening under that was going to be using the name Delaware Distilling, and Dogfish Head was making a product called Blue Hen Vodka. So Blue Hens are the Delaware thing. So there was already a few things that were off the table from our perspective. And we really liked this name, Painted Stave. It gave us a nice visual image that we could use on our logo. It had the tie-in with barrel-aged spirits and kind of a unique history to it. Somewhat problematic in that not everybody knows what a stave is, so we do spend a lot of time explaining to people what staves are. But it's a learning opportunity because we have barrels in the tasting room that have painted staves on them, and so when people ask, we could just point at that and say, that's a painted stave right there. And we've even actually taken it into a unique way with working with local artists. So our space has allowed us to have a lot more area than we thought, and we actually built a section of it out as an art gallery. So we use it as our sort of lounge art gallery space. And for the first few years, we did it once a year, and now we do it every couple of years. We take apart a barrel, get the staves out in the hands of lots of different artists, and let them paint the staves. And then we hang them all up in the gallery, and we use it as an opportunity to auction them off and raise money for a local education foundation that we partner with to do some of the outreach and getting young girls or keeping young girls engaged in science and math education. So it ended up being something we could use in a lot of different ways, which is why I think in the long run, it was probably a great thing that happened in that we needed to make this pivot. Now, it was really frustrating when we were, trying to figure out how to open our business, and we're just a couple of guys trying to navigate a much more complex legal space than we were ready for. But in the end, we're pretty pleased with how it sort of played out.
Did the brew pub that was doing the Delaware Distilling end up happening, or was that not with us anymore? Okay. I mean, like I said, so we mentioned earlier the like the Silver Screen vodka, the Candy Manor gin. It's now Painted Stave as the kind of broad name of the products. Painted Stave, bourbon, rye. The proximity is an exception on that, but that's an exclusive release. So I think is that just to the distillery?
Yeah,
yeah.
That is what it just.
Right. So exclusive to the distillery. So you got a little more wiggle room there. Don't have to deal with distributor recognition or anything like that. Product that you were able to keep the name for, and God, I love this and have no idea what it would taste like, is the Off the Hoof.
Yes.
Your Scrapple vodka, or Ode to Scrapple, you call it one.
Ode to Scrapple, yeah. So we started with the idea that we were going to make all of our products in some way have a bit of a tie-in with the theater or the history, right? You mentioned it. We kind of went at it from this perspective of being a house of brands. And some of that came from Andrew and Brian up at Philadelphia Distilling. They were making Blue Coat Gin, and they were making, every one of their products had a different name to it, Vieux Carré Absinthe. And it seemed to make a lot of sense. So we went down that path as at the beginning of it, that house of brands approach to it. And so we were trying to find different ways of fitting in those references. We did a couple of different flavored vodkas, one that we called Time Warp Espresso Vodka with an ode to the Rocky Horror Picture Show. We did Scarlet Cranberry Vodka with an ode to Gone with the Wind. The Off the Hoof, it was a joke, is what it essentially was. In the spring of 2012, we were out at the ADI conference in Louisville. The whole thing was taking place at Ted Hubert's place, Starlight Distilling, was where we were at, or winery mostly. The distilling was quite small at that point in time there. And back when you could still do this, everyone did the big bottle share at the end, where just tables full of bottles, and everyone is just standing around and trying on all of the stuff that everyone had showed up with. And the Corsair had brought like 50 different products or something like that. There was just like crazy amounts of stuff. Yeah. But there was some really weird stuff. People are pulling bottles out of their coats and everybody's trying all of this stuff. There's only a couple hundred people there at that point. Now these conferences have thousands and thousands of people that show up. This was like 400 people hanging out at a farm kind of thing. But we tried some really unique things. We tried the precursor to the salmon vodka from Alaska, the white vodka made from milk from Vermont. Some of these just and they all were of a place, right? They're like that is the most Alaska thing you could be. And so we were driving back from, a week of distillery tours and all this sort of stuff. And we were like, what is the most Delaware thing we could possibly make? There were already folks who were making Old Bay flavored vodka, another distillery that's closed now, unfortunately. And so we're like, okay, well, we can't go towards the crab side of things because that's a big Delaware thing, but it was already in that space. And so we sort of joked, we're like, oh, we could make Scrapple flavored vodka. And for folks who don't know what Scrapple is, which is probably most people, Scrapple is a breakfast meat product, kind of like a unholy cross between Spam and sausage. It comes in loaf form, not terribly attractive, but it is very, very popular. We have, there's a couple of large manufacturers for it here in Delaware. You do see it up in Pennsylvania as well. There's a little debate about, whose Scrapple is better, Pennsylvania versus Delaware. But it is something that I had never heard of until I came to Delaware, and most people have never heard of until they landed in this area. You take it, you slice it, you fry it, and you put it on your Scrapple egg and cheese sandwich, or you have it like sausage on your plate for breakfast. That's typically how it's consumed. So we joked around, oh, we could make Scrapple flavored vodka. And the immediate reaction for us is like, oh, that sounds horrible. Let's never do that. But it was a funny joke to tell people, because when people would ask us what we were planning on making, as we were, telling people about this dream, we're bringing it to life. We're going to make vodka. We're going to make gin. We're going to make bourbon. We're going to make Scrapple vodka. We're going to make rum and all these things that people would be like, wait a minute, go back. What? Scrapple vodka? And we had never intended on making it. It was just a funny thing to sort of say. And then enough people sort of reacted to it in a positive way. They sort of said, wow, that sounds awesome. And they're like, what is wrong with these people? And so one day, I think we were making gin. We had our big still fired up, and we were running gin. So we've got steam, we've got water, everything's going. And we have a smaller still that is it's a 50-gallon sort of still, test still, but we can put a little column on top of it that we've built to go along with it. And we're like, well, let's try it. Let's see what happens. And so, we pulled up recipes for how do you make Scrapple, made a shopping list, sent Ron to the store, and, came back with things like apples and bay leaf and nutmeg and Scrapple. And we chopped it all up and we threw it in the pot, and with some NGS, some corn-based NGS, because corn is another big ingredient in Scrapple, and distilled it off. And what came through was this very savory herbal spirit, a lot of sage and a lot of black pepper. Unfortunately, we've got a tasting room, right? So we took this stuff out to the tasting room and we let people try it, and the reaction was really positive. And we're like, well, we got to find some other people. These people something's wrong here. And we got enough good feedback. It took a little while. I mean, from a product development perspective, we tinkered with it for probably 6 months, make another really small batch, see how it worked. Trying to figure out how we would scale it was one of the sort of most daunting tasks to it. And so I think probably about a year and a half maybe into operations, we released Off the Hoof Scrapple flavored vodka. And most people drink it in Bloody Marys like that. And we targeted it for Bloody Marys as this thing because it is this cool, savory set of flavors. And it really does work very well with Bloody Marys. But for dirty martinis, and we make a drink with it called a scrapple driver, which is like breakfast in a glass. So we use some orange juice and some maple syrup and some scrapple flavored vodka, and when we do it, people love it. So it's weird.
It's funny. I have no idea what that would taste like. The closest thing I can think of that I've had is probably one of those bacon vodkas that came out years ago, but that had no bacon in
It's
them.
way better than that.
Right. Yeah, those were crap. Sorry, but they were.
Liquids. No. Also, ours is not vegan or kosher, and yet that bacon vodka was both vegan and kosher.
I remember you saying that in one interview, and I was like, yeah, that's no, even with the like 1/60th rule in there, this can't do that.
Yeah,
that's a deep cut reference if anyone gets that. If you do, I'd love to hear from you. But so I know we're just at about time, and I know there's a bunch more to talk about, but the proximity malt is done in conjunction with Proximity Malt House.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So they're what, about an hour, 2 hours south of you guys?
Yeah, about an hour and 20 minutes south. Pretty much the southern point of the state, or very close to it.
Gotcha. Yeah. So for grain sourcing purposes, especially for malt, basically your backyard. You don't have to go very far. You've put a premium overall on sourcing your grains whenever possible from Delaware
Mm-hmm.
farmers, whether it be corn, rye, whatever. Clearly, it's a big rye state. And the proximity was, as you mentioned, it's an approximation of that 42 malt blend that you had. It knocked it down to 8, but it fits in the American single malt category, but it has this unique flavor to it that I'll describe in the taste notes more, but it is quite dark.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of surprised by that, given, you know what, I'll rephrase that. I was surprised by it. There was no reason for me to be surprised. Like it wasn't hidden. You had talked about on the website or in interviews that there's a lot of like dark roasted and coffee malts in there. So I wasn't expecting it to be necessarily kind of on the bright light spectrum, but I think it took me off guard as to how almost stout-esque it was in the malt spectrum. So if you get a chance to drive over to Painted Stave and grab a bottle of this and try it, 1 bottle a year, like there's not a lot. So it's worth seeking out. Because again, it's another American single malt that is very, I'll use unique again. It's very unique. I don't remember having another one that was this kind of coffee and dark chocolate-esque without outright saying that it was that, like saying it was a coffee malt. I'm thinking of, for example, spoke recently with Charbet in California, and they have a stout whiskey, whiskey distilled from stout. And yes, they list it out, but they're listing it out. So that to me would qualify. And yet I would still say theirs was more on the milder side of the stout spectrum, as yours is like really going to the chocolate and coffee roast. So
yeah,
there. But
it's a spot in the world of making, and a lot of friends making beer. Most folks would not use as much of the roasted, the really dark malts, right? They're used in small percentages, sort of sparingly added to it. Ours was, because it came from this 42 malt, where it was just like, we're just going to throw it all in there and see what happens. If we hadn't had that as the origin for it, we probably wouldn't have tried just going as deep into those things. Like when that mash goes into the still, it tastes like a chocolate stout. It is, really, really dark. It is like a dry chocolate stout. And what you see come through are really like those dark and rich characteristics. And then we throw it into a heavy char barrel to kick in the oak and everything to it. Again, an opportunity to have a little bit of fun. Right? The American single malt space is obviously pretty new, but it's very flexible from the perspective of what you can create within the bounds of those rules. Right? It has to be from malt. But after that, the world's your oyster, and there's so much variety in malt that it's just a fun way. We've got some other, American single malt recipes that we've played with that are sitting in casks that eventually will hit the light of day and try things like that out. But 42 was just sort of it was a dumb luck product, and then people liked it so much, we had to figure out how to try and make more of it. And unfortunately, it still does for those people who are really into those dark characteristics. It's a fan favorite.
I was quite pleased with it. And again, my reviews and tasting notes will be up when the episode goes live in the show notes. In just the last minute or so, because I want to hang on for a minute after the recording, being right now of the last one of the first two, and now of the last two remaining Delaware distilleries, you've established a style, multiple styles across products, I would say, that you can point to. And both you and Ron are also relatively young guys. So, you've got what I think is fair to say, you've got a potentially long history to go, long future to go in the industry to keep going. So for all of this, what do you feel like your legacy has been so far, and what would you like it to get to?
One of the things that I think we find the most energizing about what we get to do is the community that we've built around the distillery. We have a great craft, like sort of cocktail tasting room. We do lots of events. We do cocktail classes. That's what we're doing this weekend. We do drunk history classes where we sort of teach people all about different spirits or different places. Really, I think what keeps us really excited about this and having a lot of fun building this is that we have this wonderful community of people around that we get to share it with. Certainly the craft beverage world in general, but the craft distilling world and craft beer world right now are going through some tough times. A lot of people are closing their doors. People who were here before us are closing them. People who started up after us are closing their doors. We're watching the distribution landscape change, and many of the distilleries are pulling back from they were in lots of states, and now they're very, very hard to get. We've seen that stuff happen to us. But the thing that hasn't really changed is that place that we get to be within our community. And we get to continue to do even more of that, being this sort of third space where people come together. Like performed weddings for people who met at our distillery. Those are these wonderful little bits of the story that I think, even as much as I love the products and I love the distilling and all of that, there is a community around this, and our business sort of has created this niche within our community that is the thing that I think will ultimately be the legacy of our business, and that will live on. Hopefully after Ron and I, my kids already think that they're going to, take this from me and go off and run it someday. But even after we're gone, I hope that is the thing that sticks around. Now, I want to make obviously the best spirits that I can. I want to share really fun and unique things with the world. But the thing that I think people are going to remember at the end of the day may not be the nuances of one particular product or the bourbon, but it may be the relationships, the friendships, and the fun that they had at our spot. And I think that is rewarding in ways that I never expected.
I love it. And just as a final note to that, I know you and your wife and family have really bought into being in the area. I think you're on the town council. Is that correct? So,
yeah, I was until recently.
So, you're in there. And so it's a give and take clearly from the community. And I love to see that. So again, there were a couple of things we didn't get to, just time's sake. Mike, and I'll add those in the show notes. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time to introduce us to Delaware Distilling, not the company, but Delaware Distilling, to the different spirits you're making at Painted Stave. First time going into Delaware for a distillery, and really excited to taste what else you got and to share you with more people and hopefully get your name out there even more.
I appreciate it. Thank you, David.
Awesome. So hang on with me for just a sec after I finish recording. If you like what you heard, you can like, rate, and subscribe on all the major podcast platforms. Please do follow on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn now. And I will see you all next week.